So thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you to our organizers for including me in the program, and really special thank you to Boaz and Miriam for all the organizational work that they've done to pull off what has been really a fascinating, thought-provoking first 2 days, and I know tomorrow will be great as well. So thank you very much. So as you've heard, this is a project that I'm sort of working on the side among many other projects. My main area of research looks at Jewish life in the aftermath of the Holocaust, primarily in the DP camps. I'm working on a book now that looks at the place of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising as a symbol of resistance during and after the war. But I've done a lot of work with children of survivors in the Hartford area, and as we were thinking about this conference and the idea of the future of Holocaust Testimonies, it struck me that this was an important topic to add to the discussion, especially, and Kara just raised this point in the last session, especially as we look at the passing of the survivor generation and really think about what role the children of survivors are going to play. And so this is something that I want us to consider here, and it's sort of in dialogue with some of the points that you just raised. So over the past 35 or so years, there's been a growing body of literature that has documented the lasting effect of the Holocaust on the children and grandchildren of survivors. Various studies have pointed to the intergenerational transmission of both trauma and resilience in the families of survivors, while indicating the central impact of the Holocaust in identity development amongst the next generations. The Holocaust has become a cornerstone of contemporary Jewish practice in the 21st century in the broader Jewish community, even for those with no direct relation to survivors. And here what I'm showing you is some of the results from the 2013 Pew Foundation. This was a portrait of Jewish Americans, which was meant to be a snapshot of what the American Jewish community looked like. And for me, as a Holocaust scholar, one of the most fascinating aspects was the response to this question: what does it mean to be Jewish? And in the survey, and I'll just explain briefly because many of you may not be familiar with this survey, they asked people to respond to a list of 9 things. Tell me which of these you consider to be essential part of what being Jewish means to you. And you can see on the list here of things that they're asked: eating Jewish foods, observing Jewish law, being part of a Jewish community. The number one response, 73% of respondents said remembering the Holocaust is essential to what being Jewish means to them. So this is fascinating to me. It needs to be explored in greater detail, but I think this sort of provides some context as we've raised what does it mean to remember the Holocaust in the 21st century. What does it mean to remember, in quotes, something that you never experienced, right? So I want us to think about that as a bit of context. In contemporary Jewish literature, and I know Rebecca is going to engage with this specifically, as the search for Jewish identity in the form of a collective Jewish past has taken on increasing prominence, Jewish writers in the first decade of the 21st century have consistently returned to the subject of the Holocaust. And as you heard, I recently co-edited an anthology of contemporary Jewish fiction, and it's fascinating the volume of current literature that continues to return to the subject of the Holocaust, very often, as I'm sure Rebecca will focus on, by the children and grandchildren of survivors. And so that's something that we'll hear more about. With the passing of the survivor generation, amidst rising anxiety about how to continue to tell the stories of survivors, self-identified second and third generation descendants of survivors have created organizations around the world determined to keep the stories of their loved ones alive. And yet many of these groups have struggled to tell the stories of their parents and grandparents and have rarely been asked to tell their own stories. And so the purpose of the In Our Own Words Oral History Project at the University of Hartford is to collect and record the testimonies of children and grandchildren of survivors in Greater Hartford. And thus far, through a grant from the Jewish Community Foundation of Greater Hartford, we've collected approximately 50 of these interviews, and we've asked subjects to talk about their own understanding of their parents' experiences, when they first learned about their parents' experiences, the impact of perhaps intergenerational transmission of trauma, the nature of the child's experience growing up as the child of a survivor, the effects of resilience, and more. And one of the points of why I wanted to share this here is I think that this is something that can be fascinating on a comparative, let's say, transnational perspective. And my hope is to find partners in Israel, in Australia, in England, and all over the world, because I think this is, yes, Poland, I don't want to leave anyone out. I mean, I think it's something that's really fascinating that can be done on a comparative level. One thing that has become clear is that this term second generation, right, that we use, or 2G, doesn't tell us very much. It needs to really be unpacked because there's such an incredible diversity, variety of ways in which children and grandchildren of survivors engage with the Holocaust. Some have made telling and retelling stories of parents and grandparents a focal point of family lore, creating elaborate family ceremonies to guarantee memorialization, or traveling with a survivor to a site of pre-war Jewish life or a site of destruction of the family during the war, while others have done exactly the opposite, creating an emotional distance from the subject matter. As the survivor generation passes away, and this number, 250,000 children of survivors in the USA, this comes from Arlene Stein, Reluctant Witnesses, it's clear that this generation will have a central role to play in shaping the nature of Holocaust memory going into the future. As Kara alluded to, it's already happening, that we have children of survivors going into classrooms to tell their parents' stories, working in museums, and this is very much sort of also a process of self-selection, a great deal of volunteerism involved, sort of how am I going to play a role in all of this, and a growing impulse to retell. And so one of the things that I want to do here is focus on why, obviously, the second generation wants to retell, but also assess the readiness of the second generation, the children of survivors, to become carriers of the flame of memory, and what we can learn from these discrepancies, differences between families about the impact that the second generation and their children will have on the shape of Holocaust memory into the future. And one thing that I think is important to point out is that the purpose of this project is not to examine the degree to which children know their parents' stories, right? It's not to test sort of how valid are their testimonies, because with the many resources available from the Shoah Foundation, from Fortunoff, from the Holocaust Museum, and elsewhere, it's become clear that on some level children don't necessarily feel a need to know every detail of their parents' story, to retell every aspect of it, and I think this is something important that I want us to discuss as well. But as you can see, these are some of the questions that I think that we need to engage with. Now, because my time is limited and I want to share some of these interviews with you, I'm going to skip over the section on sort of background literature, just to say that there is an extensive literature. Eva Hoffman talks about the role of children of survivors as the hinge generation. Marianne Hirsch, as we discussed on day one, talking about post-memory and what that actually means. The relationship that the generation after those who witnessed bears to the experiences of those who came before, and how they, quote-unquote, remember things that they only heard about or saw testimonies of. Arlene Stein has made an argument for the agency of the second generation in elevating the place of the Holocaust onto the public and cultural platform. We can discuss that further. I don't necessarily agree with all of her points as to that the second generation are the agents, but that's something for a different discussion. So let me tell you a little bit about these testimonies. Our project, first of all, seeks to collect the testimonies of children of survivors first in Hartford and hopefully later in other communities around the world. Generally, they don't last more than 45 minutes. They are videotaped, as you will see here. The interviews or the oral histories do not follow a rigid questionnaire, but instead have just a number of themes that are focused upon. And in general, subjects are first asked to talk about their parents' story. Then they are asked to discuss when they learned about it, how this knowledge affected them at the time, subsequently. And then we get into a discussion of, has this story become your own story? Is it a mission for you? Discussion of behaviors with which they were raised. As I discussed before, there is incredible variety amongst the children of survivors in the way in which they relate to these stories. And what I'd like to do is start with Jeff, who you can see here. And one of the things that's interesting about Jeff, so Jeff's father, Kurt, was actually interviewed by the Fortunoff Video Archive, and I have a number of these where we can sort of compare the child to the parents. Jeff's father, Kurt, was interviewed by Fortunoff, and his mother also was a refugee from Germany whose family came to the United States after Kristallnacht. Jeff actually starts his testimonies, and he told me that this is what he does every time he goes into schools. He starts by blowing a shofar that his grandfather managed to smuggle out of Germany. And I find this fascinating, as sort of bringing an artifact into the classroom that his grandfather was able to smuggle out of Germany. And a shofar, of course, is also a tool of memory, right? A shofar is supposed to help you fulfill the commandment to remember. So let me just play a little clip here for you. Hopefully it won't be too loud.
Compared to the other one I have at home, which is 4 feet long, it's very mellow sounding. But as I blow this, it gets a little bit better, but I think it's a little bit more awakening. And I do take this along with me to when I speak, and it's the first thing I do after I'm introduced. I don't say a word. I bring this out of the bag, and I start blowing it. And all of a sudden, the feeling in the room is, are we in the wrong auditorium, or what's going on? And then I start to get people into our background, saying how this could have meant the lives of 4 people. And then I get into the story of what that meant, because you really don't understand that. Those couple of words, this could have been responsible for the deaths of 4 more Jews.
Okay. And he's of course referring to that if his family had been caught smuggling this out, along with a Sefer Torah from their hometown, what might have happened to them. Some of the children of survivors talk very specifically about the close connection that they have to this, and the centrality of the identity of their parent as a survivor to their own identity. And also the way in which growing up as a child of a survivor has, quote, made them feel special. Just as Jeff talks about using the shofar as a tool of memory, other children of survivors have tools that they use to help employ to carry their own memories. Gail's father, you can see here, his name is Abby. He's a survivor from Siget. And actually, after Wolf talked about the Shoah Foundation, I knew that they had been interviewed by Shoah, and I pulled this up last night, a screenshot of sort of the gallery of images. You can see that at the end of the Shoah Foundation testimonies, a lot of times they would bring in the families. And so here's Gail standing behind her father at the end of the Shoah Foundation testimony, which is sort of fascinating to think about, because now here she is, as the child of the survivor, inscribed into the testimonial process. And this was about 20 years ago, right? And here she is more recently with her father. He, along with sort of a very similar trajectory to Elie Wiesel, was taken from Siget in May of 1944, ended up in Auschwitz, and then eventually liberated from Buchenwald. The part that I want to play for you here is something that a very unique commemorative practice that her family developed, which I'll play for you here, which shows a process that they've developed. Gail feels very much responsible for making sure that not only her children, but her brother and her brother's children understand the importance of what their father went through. Interestingly, Gail has gone with her father to the sites of memory. She's taken him to Auschwitz, to Buchenwald. Her brother has not. Right? So this is another thing that's interesting about sort of differences within families. But I'll play this short clip for you. This is what they do every year on Holocaust Remembrance Day.
Every year on Holocaust Remembrance Day, my father had stars made up that we've all worn with his number, which is A-7705.
I'm sorry, you can't see the numbers,
and with his father's number, A-7706. And what's interesting is my dad always wears his father's number, and we've always worn my father's number. So he doesn't wear his own anymore. He wears his dad's as a memorial for him. And this has become something that my father made, and we keep with us, and we just kind of take it out, for Yom HaShoah to memorialize the numbers that they had to wear. And this is the number on my dad's arm. And then on April 11th, which is my dad's liberation date, it's usually around Passover time. For the past 30 years, we've been giving him a Kiddush cup. And on the Kiddush cup, we put his name. And then we put April 11th, 1945, and then April 11th to whatever the year is at this current time.
Okay. And she talks about how April 11th becomes another birthday for her father. Some of the children of survivors talk very specifically about sort of the centrality of their parents' story to their own identity. So this is Natan, who's originally from Israel, but now lives in West Hartford. Both his parents, Yosef and Zofia from Drohobych, were survivors. And here he's talking about an artifact that his mother preserved from her time in Auschwitz. And here he's going to talk about that this whistle that he's holding was the whistle of Irma Grace, the guard. She gave it to him to preserve, not to give to Yad Vashem, not to give to Miriam. It's his artifact. And I want you to listen to how he talks about sort of what these memories mean to him.
And I can see terrible, it's all vivid. Although I was not there, I can see how, Irma Grace is whistling to chase, to take the dog chase after, the poor women in Auschwitz, killing those women. I can see how vivid as it happened now, a lineup, and how those women are being shot after another, only by one whistle to make sure that they will stand up in a line. I can see all those things as they really happen. You asked me if I'm angry. When I happen to see all those things, and when I live through those things, although I'm second generation, it never happened to me, for some reason, I think that I am first generation. I had many nights of bad dreams about it. I have lived through it as I was a person who went through the Holocaust. And this is something that I grew up with until, I would say, even until today. And I was very passionate about it, and I probably will continue being passionate about it, telling it to whoever I can, whoever asks me questions, especially to my grandchildren so they can forward it to their children.
Okay. So in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over some of these last ones. But I just want to make the point that while Natan and Gail talk in very detailed sort of sense about how central this is to their identity, and it's clear to what degree it's been transferred to them, or they see it as something that's been transferred to them, it's also important to note that those children of survivors who talk about sort of how little they know, or reflect on what great parents their parents were, and studies that have come out have shown that there's nothing, sort of no validity to the sense that Holocaust survivors were any better or worse parents than the average population, right? This is sort of a common misconception. Sharon talks about what great parents she had. This is Leon, who, as we mentioned yesterday, was the child who was saved by Metropolitan Sheptytsky, in a monastery that was in Univ in the Ukraine. And this is a USHMM testimony. This is his son Dave talking about what an amazing person his father is, right? And how he's the smartest person he's ever met. So let me just say a couple words of conclusion by way of wrapping up. This brief overview of this new project points not only to the significance of the children of survivors in continuing the work of their parents in Holocaust education, but also suggests important ways in which children may filter or translate such memories for a broader audience in the future. Children's experiences are quite variable due to many factors. Having one or two parents who survived, the role of non-survivor parents in their upbringing, the relationship of their siblings to the story of survival, the perceived impact of the parent on the child's development, the relative burden of the parent's experience on the development of the child, and more. Not all members of the, quote, second generation relate to their parents' experiences in the same way. Just as each survivor's experience is unique, so are those of their children. There's a real division of labor as to which child decides to take on this responsibility. And as I mentioned, we didn't ask the children to study their parents' their story before. And I think that this points to perhaps one of the unintended consequences of the collection projects, which is generally oral history is passed down from one generation to the next. But in the case of the success of video documentation projects, it's unclear to what extent those stories have been passed from one generation to the next because they're preserved on videos. And when you ask the kids, have you watched the videos, a lot of them have not. So something interesting to think about. Nonetheless, and this is my last sentence, one thing is clear: the children, either as reluctant witnesses, carriers of post-memory, or the Hinge generation, will play a critical role in shaping Holocaust commemoration in the 21st century, and we must examine the role they will play in keeping their parents' memories alive. Thank you.